This is Tim RIggins, and when he was a kid, he and his brother were abandoned by their parents and were forced to find their own way in life, leading Tim to start drinking and partying, and overall being known as a screw-up. And even though football was another thing that Tim screwed up with a lot, one game, Tim RIggins got an opportunity that could have changed everything. Because when the star running back came out the game, Tim showed that he was more than capable of being a dominant player himself, and eventually became the feature back for the Dillon Panthers, leading them to a ton of victories. But by the end of his high school career, Tim decided that he didn't want to take football that seriously, and he never got a chance to see what his true potential could be. So today we are putting Tim RIggins into College Football 25. We're going to see what happens when Tim makes football more of a priority, and we'll follow him on his road to glory. Now, coming out of high school, Tim RIggins decided that it was going to be important for him to win a national championship and one day make it to the NFL. And as a four-star recruit, he had plenty of options to come in and potentially get some quality playing time. But you see, a lot of people back home knew that another thing that was important to Tim was his ex-girlfriend Lila. And when he found out that she was going to a college that just so happened to be a part of one of the top conferences in all of college football, that would make his college decision a little bit easier, as he would ultimately decide to sign with Vanderbilt. Now, when Tim first arrived on campus, they did not have his number 33 available, so he had to get a little bit creative and figured 3 + 3 was good enough. But to start his freshman season, Tim RIggins was going to be a backup. But at practice, he was doing a pretty good job. He had a great ability to break off tackles, as he was always trying to make the most of his runs. But now it was time for Tim RIggins to get into his first college football game, and he's just hoping that he plays well enough to impress his ex-girlfriend, who still doesn't know that he signed with Vanderbilt. But Tim knows that a great way to get his ex-girlfriend back is to have a great game in his first one against Virginia Tech. Now, unfortunately, Tim didn't really get to play until the second quarter, but at least when he did, his very first play in college went for a 5-yard reception, and they actually brought Tim back in a couple plays later for his very first handoff, and he was able to power his way for a first down. Tim got a couple more plays in before being taken out until the fourth quarter, where after Tim fails to make the reception right here, this offense would come off the field and eventually go on to lose this game, with Virginia Tech finishing off the job 16-10. And unfortunately, Tim didn't really do too much because he didn't have too much playing time. But it was still enough to get a text from his ex-girlfriend after the game, telling Tim that she wants him to come hang out. And you already know Tim was ready to go. I mean, he could barely believe that his plan was already working, and he truly felt like he and his ex-girlfriend were on the road to getting back together. But Tim still had a long season ahead of him, so he was out there at practice doing whatever this was in order to get prepared for his next game against the UGF Pandas. Now, in this game, they put Tim out there in the first quarter, and they got him the ball right away. He was out there breaking off tackles saying "Shablaka" and picked up a big first down on his very first play. And they actually had Tim out there blocking a lot at wide receiver, but eventually they would get down to the goal line. And they're actually allowing Tim the opportunity to take this touch pass. And he was actually able to find an open lane for an easy walk-in touchdown, coming up with his first score of his college football career. And this is a moment that he never thought that he'd see, especially not at this level, but nevertheless, Tim RIggins has arrived. In the second half, they gave the ball to Tim for a couple carries before taking him out the game, only just to bring him back later on in the drive down at the goal line, where they would hand the ball off to him once again, and Tim RIggins was fighting for his first career rushing touchdown. And already in his second career game, he's coming up with multiple scores. And by the end of this game, Tim had helped bring his team to a 24-7 lead, and eventually the 27-7 victory, as Vanderbilt goes on to win their first game of the season. And Tim RIggins is actually voted player of the game. And it's no surprise that with his performance, his ex-girlfriend Lila was trying to hang out again, asking him if he wanted to come out to a party, to which Tim easily said yes. And Tim realized that the more he plays well, the more that he gets to hang out with her. So eventually he's going to have to take over this starting spot. But the only way to do that is by taking it 1 week at a time at this point. So Tim was just hoping to impress the coaches a lot in his next game against Georgia Tech. Now, I think the coaches were impressed with Tim RIggins' performance against the UGF Pandas, because they put him out here early in this game and he was making some plays. He brought his team down inside the red zone before one of his teammates were able to make the reception and get himself across the goal line for the first touchdown in this game. But especially throughout the second half, this coaching staff was letting Tim RIggins run that rock, and he was making the most of his opportunities, coming up with multiple 10+ yard runs. And by the end of the game, Vanderbilt would go on to win 19-7, with Tim RIggins not going for any touchdowns but still going for 88 yards on the ground. Not bad for a backup, but Tim was also wondering why he was getting a lot of carries. For now, he was just going to be grateful that he had a really solid game, going for over 100 all-purpose yards. But just because football was going well, it didn't mean that school was. Because I'll tell you guys right now, Tim RIggins did not come here to play no damn school. But unfortunately, Tim was told that the starting running back was just injured in the last game, and that he'll be back the following week against Missouri, and Tim might not get as much playing time. So as Tim and his Vanderbilt team went into Missouri, he was really just hoping that he would at least get some reps with the starter coming back. And after sitting him out for a little bit, eventually Tim did get in the game. They gave him a little outside handoff towards the left side, and Tim was making the most of it with a 20+ yard carry, coming up with a big play before immediately being taken out the game. They were giving the ball back to Tim right before halftime, and he almost broke loose again. And with how well Tim RIggins has been playing, it seems like Vanderbilt didn't play him enough in this game, because as the scoreboard reflects, Vanderbilt was down by multiple possessions, and taking Tim RIggins in and out the game definitely didn't help, as they would ultimately go on to lose 28-25. Another loss for Vanderbilt on their season, but this running back right here is about to take a double loss, because it looks like he's about to lose his starting spot, because this is what Tim RIggins was waiting for. He knew that if he could become the starting running back for Vanderbilt, then his ex-girlfriend would really take him seriously and they could eventually get back together. So Tim went out there and balled in his practice. He earned himself the position as the #1 running back for Vanderbilt. But going forward, Tim knew that he still had a lot of work to do, because he wasn't exactly the best running back in the country. And in order to have really good games, he was going to have to get better. But for now, Tim was just looking forward to getting into his very first college football game as a starter. And it just so happened to be against one of the best teams in the country, the Alabama Crimson Tide. In his first game as a starter, Tim RIggins was running really well, picking up first downs and eventually moving his team past midfield, where on this third down they would ultimately get stopped and were forced to settle for 3. Now luckily Bama gave Vanderbilt the ball right back with great field position, allowing them to move swiftly towards the goal line, and with the help of Tim RIggins they were able to cross over it for their first touchdown of the game, tying it up at 7 points apiece against one of the best teams in the entire nation. And I don't know what's up with Alabama, but once again, they're giving Vanderbilt great field position. And Tim RIggins is out there saying shaplaka, stiff-arming folks and moving the chains. Now, unfortunately, that drive would only end in 3 points, but they would get the ball back on offense now with the lead. And with Tim RIggins taking the screen pass and making the most out of it, bringing his team across midfield, and giving them momentum where they would eventually go down to the goal line, hand the ball off to Tim RIggins, and he would get stuffed. And they take Tim out the game, but somehow they still score. And even though Vanderbilt's offense would struggle a lot throughout the fourth quarter, with Alabama's offense failing to score any touchdowns throughout the second half, all it would take was a couple more Tim RIggins runs to put this game away, as Vanderbilt goes on to take down one of the top teams in the entire country 17-10. And Tim RIggins by far having his best game with 135 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns. And of course, with Tim having an incredible game like this, leading his team to a major upset, it's no surprise that he would score a full-on date with Lila. And Tim knew that it wouldn't be long before they would finally get things back to where they were when they were back home in Texas. I mean, Tim was in love with this girl, man. He was willing to do anything to make that happen, even if that meant taking down another SEC opponent in his next game against Kentucky. To start this game off, Tim didn't really have to do much, as his offense was able to lead themselves down the field and eventually get across the goal line for a touchdown, putting the first points on the board to get this game going. Later on, though, Tim would start really contributing as he got another touchdown on his season, crossing over the goal line for a score that made it 14-7. And even though sometimes in his game, Tim RIggins was out there saying, hey, and picking up first downs, this game would actually end up being a really close one. And for whatever reason, they have Tim out there playing wide receiver, but he gets wide open, and he goes out there and absolutely obliterates this boy's ankle, snaps that shit in half. Thank you. And yeah, he could have had a touchdown, but he was definitely trying to celebrate too early, so yeah, that was crazy. Regardless, it would only be a play later where Tim would go out there and stiff arm his own teammate to the ground for a touchdown to put this game away, with Vanderbilt going on to finish the job on the road 24-17. In another game where Tim had over 100 yards rushing and 75 yards receiving, and he would actually go on to win SEC Offensive Player of the Week. Now at this point for Tim RIggins, things were going amazing. He was having tons of success on the field, but as far as off the field, Tim was about to receive some catastrophically bad news, because it turns out that people caught Lila sneaking into another man's crib trying to get freaky. And when Tim asked her if it was true, she tried to apologize, but yeah, see, Tim wasn't having none of that. Yep, see? He got right up and said, Lila. And he pretty much promised himself to never speak to that girl again. And you see, now a lot of people didn't know that Tim was dealing with some really serious heartache. Because as you can see, man, like, fuck being down bad, that boy was down atrocious. I mean, never in a million years did he think Lila was like that. But all he could do was just pick himself up and get ready for his next game, as he and Vanderbilt were about to get ready to face off against Ball State. It was yet another game where Tim's offense didn't need him to get down the field and score, and it just reminded him further about how Lila didn't need him either. But Tim didn't let that get to him too much while he was playing the game at least. He was playing as well as he usually does, and was actually making himself a serious receiving threat. He would eventually go out there and go in for a receiving touchdown that would pretty much put this game against Ball State out of reach, with Tim having gone for 150 plus scrimmage yards. But even though Tim RIggins was playing well, as soon as he was done with football for the day, he didn't really want to talk to anybody. He didn't want to hang out, he didn't want to go party, but instead he put a lot of time into trying to get better at football, becoming the best player that he can possibly be. So through these dark times, Tim realizes that throughout the rest of the season, he needs to play well not for anybody else, but for himself. And in a game against the one and only Texas Longhorns, Tim RIggins was playing more than just well, because throughout the entire first half, he was leading his team to a pretty dominant performance. And by the second half, it didn't really look like there was any signs of stopping, as he would cross over the goal line for his second touchdown of the game on the ground, making it a 21-3 lead over the Longhorns. And by the time the fourth quarter rolled around, Tim RIggins was running angry, because he was just out there steamrolling guys, and just look at this! Bruh, Tim RIggins literally grabbed this dude by the neck, said, "Get the fuck off me." Bro ran around the edge and seen these two guys, so he went up to him and said, "Hey," and created an easy lane for him to go all the way towards the end zone for a touchdown. And I don't know what the hell that was right there. Yeah, he tweaking. But anyway, Vanderbilt would go on to close this game out, 28-17. And it was led by another incredible performance by Tim RIggins, going for 121 yards on the ground and 3 touchdowns. And even though pretty much everybody knew that the reason why Vanderbilt was playing well was because of Tim RIggins would never pass up an opportunity to give credit to his team and to his coaches.
Coach is always talking about one team and one heart. To be honest with you, I thought it was stupid. Fact is, he's right.
Now, Tim would go on to win his first National Offensive Player of the Week of the season, and he wasn't really surprised that Lila was trying to get him back now. But Tim already promised himself he wasn't going to talk to her no more, so that shit was over. And that was good for Tim, but what wasn't good for Tim was the fact that he was sleeping in a lot during class. He just wasn't focusing on anything other than football, which to be fair was probably why he was one of the top rushers in the nation. And as the season went on, he felt confident that his team would continue to win. So he was looking forward to getting into his next SEC matchup as Vanderbilt was set to face off against Auburn. Now this was a game where Vanderbilt started slow and was actually down by multiple possessions up until later in the second quarter, where a receiver caught a pass to make it a 7-point deficit, so that later on when the third quarter rolled around, Tim RIggins could steamroll over defenders and bring his team in scoring position. They eventually got down to the goal line where a pass to Tim RIggins out in the flat was all that was needed to get in the end zone and tie this game up, eventually leading to the fourth quarter where it's still tied at 14. Vanderbilt's offense was able to get things going without Tim RIggins and eventually took him out. It was all good though because Vanderbilt still won this game 17-14. And Tim RIggins had a hell of a game through the air with 111 receiving yards. But unfortunately, there was about to be some unexpected and undeserving news headed Tim RIggins' way, because Tim's head coach actually texted him accusing him of trying to sleep with his daughter, and told him that he's going to be suspended from the team until further notice. But little does coach know that Tim was actually protecting his daughter. He was trying to save her from some dude that was trying to get her all drunk. But even though Tim was out here trying to be a good guy and do the right thing, he sure as shit was suspended. And he was going to be ineligible to play at least in the next game. But the suspension actually carried over to 3 weeks. And now Vanderbilt was sitting there at 7-3 after taking a loss to South Carolina, and was about to be suspended for another game against LSU. So all Tim really could do was just sit there and wait for coach to come to his senses. And eventually he did in the final game of the season. In a game that Vanderbilt definitely needed to win now, especially going against one of the top schools in the country, Tennessee. Now Tim came back from suspension to an unwarm welcome from Tennessee, stopping him in the backfield early on and holding this offense to a 3-and-out. And for large portions of this first half, things were not going well for Vanderbilt. They were continuously being stopped behind the line of scrimmage, and something you guys may not have seen all season, but the quarterback was throwing a lot of picks. And in this game, it just resulted in Vanderbilt being down by 7 points after halftime. But on this fourth down, Tim does a great job keeping the chains moving and bulldozing over players to get to goal territory, eventually resulting in this catch over the middle from Tim where he fought over the goal line for a touchdown, coming up with the score to get this game tied back at 13, so that when their offense gets back out there later on, they have a chance to potentially win this game. And this Tim RIggins run right here was putting them in excellent field position to do so, bringing them down to the 1-yard line, where it would only be a few plays later that Tim RIggins would cross over the goal line for another score, doing just enough to get his team the W, as they would go on to win this game 20-13. In a game where Tim RIggins rushed for 135 yards and 2 touchdowns. Another absolutely incredible performance from Tim RIggins after his suspension, but going into the following week, his head coach wants to talk to him about something.
I apologize, I was wrong.
That's fine, Coach.
No, it's not fine. I couldn't have mishandled it any worse, and I apologize. Last couple weeks, I've been giving you hell, and not once have you come to me and complained.
Tim RIggins' coach had apologized for grossly misunderstanding this situation, and Tim's not really the type of guy to hold a grudge, so it was water under the bridge for him. He was just looking forward to the chance to potentially play in the college football playoffs as a freshman. But the only thing standing in Vanderbilt's way was one of the top teams in the country, because now going into the SEC championship, Tim RIggins will have to get ready to lead his team into a matchup against the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, this game did not start out the way that Tim probably wanted to, with his quarterback throwing an interception, definitely taking points off the board that definitely would have gave his team a little something going forward. But when they got the ball back in the second quarter, Tim RIggins was doing his best to fight for extra yards. He was doing everything he could to keep this drive alive, as even on 4th down he was making plays. Then came this 3rd down and 14 where Tim was actually covered. Somehow though, he was able to make the catch and move the sticks to keep this drive alive. And it would only be a couple plays later that he crossed over the goal line for a touchdown, tying this game up at 7 apiece and giving his team a little momentum going forward. Or at least he thought it would give them momentum, because in the second half he was getting stopped in the backfield and Georgia was actually able to go back up by 7. Luckily for Vanderbilt though, Tim RIggins was putting all of his blood, sweat, and tears into this game, becoming the sole reason why they're able to get down the field on these drives, but unfortunately this one would only end in 3 points. With the 4th quarter now here though, this offense has a chance to get things going, but sadly it doesn't look like Georgia's about to let any of that happen. On back-to-back plays, Tim RIggins is not even able to get the ball in his hands, and just like that, Vanderbilt is coming right back off the field. I mean, it was no surprise that Georgia would start scoring in this game, so after yet another failed attempt to convert the sticks, they had done enough to put this game away, with Vanderbilt going on to lose this game 21-10. And despite Tim RIggins having his best game of his entire season, 100 yards rushing and 100 yards receiving, somehow, man, it just still wasn't enough. But even with Georgia's quarterback going on to win Player of the Game, the country seemed to think differently, as Tim RIggins would go on to win SEC Offensive Player of the Week. But now that the season is finally over, it's time for some awards to be given out. And Dylan Gabriel from Oregon won the Heisman Trophy. And Tim actually didn't expect to win any awards, but it turns out he would go on to win First Team All-SEC, being named as the best running back in one of the best conferences in all of college football. And he actually went on to win a bunch of other awards that really just let Tim know that he was more than capable of being great. But there was a little bittersweet moment at the end of it all when Tim realized that he wasn't going to play in the college football playoffs. Luckily, he would be able to go back home and play in Texas, so Tim knew that going into his final game of the season, he could just go out there and play freely. Just let football take his mind off of everything else. He could focus on his future after the game. But first, he had to lead Vanderbilt in a matchup against Baylor. It would take up until the second quarter for Tim RIggins to get across the goal line for a touchdown, finally getting this offense started in this game as they tie it up at 7. And this was really one of those games where Tim was just a goal line merchant, at least throughout the first 3 quarters, as he was able to get his team across the goal line twice. But it would actually be later on in the 3rd quarter where Tim would break off a tackle and eventually power his way across the goal line for his 3rd score of the game, having an incredible impact already. But I still don't think that he was done yet, because now that the 4th quarter was here, Tim knew that his season was going to be over soon, so he was just trying to go out there and have fun in the last moments of the year. He even broke loose for some big yards and tried to hurdle some guy, but that didn't work. But regardless, Tim had done enough to put this game away, as Vanderbilt would go on to win 21-16, in a game where Tim RIggins rushed for over 100 yards once again, going for 3 touchdowns as well. But now that Tim RIggins has led his team to a bowl game victory, we can check out his season stats and see that he is actually the last 1,000-yard rusher of the season, and also went on to have 13 touchdowns. He didn't go on to break any records or anything for Vanderbilt, but still, this kid worked his way up to becoming an All-American. So when thinking about his future, he realized that maybe it's best that he enter the transfer portal and find a team that could potentially help him better get to the NFL. And especially since he wasn't going to be dealing with Lila anymore, there was no reason for him to be here. So Tim went back home to Texas for the offseason to think about his future. But unfortunately, that's where things began to go downhill. And Tim RIggins was left in a situation where he was uncertain about his future of playing football. But if you want to see Season 2 of Tim RIggins and see how he got out of this situation, Be sure to subscribe to the channel down below and get this video to 1,000 likes. And also be sure to comment down below what else you guys want to see next to help this video with the algorithm. But don't forget to check out one of these other stories until the next one comes out. If you got to this point in the video, just know that I appreciate you more than you'll ever know. I hope all of your college football and NFL teams make some quality moves this offseason. And other than that, I'm going to catch you guys next time.